Puente Bridge. Stories that connect us.
Hola, and welcome to this emergency episode of Puente Bridge Podcast.
Thank you for tuning in. You may have seen on the news or social media that the current situation in Colombia right now is critical. There have been ongoing demonstrations for well over a month with extreme levels of violence.
We are Colombians, and despite living overseas from our native country, we do not stop being connected with the country and feeling pain when watching with horror what Colombia is experiencing.
And of course, we have family and friends who are in the eye of the storm. We have also seen how the information available in English is limited to conventional channels, some that only show one side of the coin.
Friends regularly ask us, what is happening in Colombia?
Due to having these questions asked, we thought it is important to release this emergency episode. We believe that it is of the utmost importance that the international community listens to the perspectives of people who are directly involved with Colombia and who have first-hand knowledge of the history and current affairs of the country.
We have brought together 4 voices that represent different types of social and political activism, and that are directly involved in the support and defense of the demonstrations and the Colombian social outcry.
To present today's episode, we invited Tara Hoyos Martínez, a British Colombian actress and presenter.
Gracias por escucharnos.
Hola, my name is Tara Hoyos Martínez. Thank you for joining us. In April 2021, massive protests began in Colombia. They have not stopped and have been ongoing for 6 weeks. These manifestations are occurring during the 3rd peak of the pandemic, the strongest so far, and when the country is in one of the most complex moments in its history. The following figures show the crisis that is faced by many Colombians. More than 42% of the Colombian population can only eat once or twice a day. It's estimated that only 22% of young Colombians achieve a university degree. More than 79,000 people have died from COVID-19, and only 4% of the population have been vaccinated. Despite calls from medical organizations, the Colombian government decided not to set tougher quarantine measures or provide real economic support for its citizens, but instead implemented an economic reactivation plan forcing millions of people back to work. It is in this context that the government of Iván Duque, with one of the lowest levels of popularity in history, presented before Congress a tax reform that sought to increase taxes, especially on the already weak Colombian middle class. It was at that point that the people exploded and took to the streets in masses. The protests advanced with high levels of approval. Polls show that between 60 and 73% of the population agree with the marches, which were brutally repressed by the government from the beginning. A week after the protests began, the Colombian president withdrew the tax reform, and the minister who proposed it resigned. However, despite this and other political and social achievements of the mobilizations, the increase in cases and mortality due to COVID-19, the alarming food shortages, and the protests all continue, as well as the confrontations with law enforcement services, adding more numbers to the tally of victims of violence in Colombia, alongside the long list of state crimes. The figures of human rights organizations in Colombia speak of 75 deaths only in the context of the protests, but there have also been hundreds of forced disappearances, thousands of injuries, and dozens of victims of sexual abuse.
Well, I think this has been really interesting as well in terms of what we've seen. So first of all, you have the National Strike Committee, which is trade unions. The major trade union centers are there, including the CUT, who we work very closely with at Justice for Colombia, and other established organizations, social organizations. So that conforms a National Strike Committee, and they called for the protests. So I'm Hasan Dodwell. I'm director at an organization called Justice for Colombia, which is an organization set up by the originally by the British trade union movement, but is now backed by both the British and Irish trade union movements, to have a permanent campaign that is able to provide international solidarity with organizations in Colombia that are working towards to advance peace, human rights, and social justice. But participation has been so broad in terms of Colombian society. And one thing that is undeniable that people have been speaking about is the involvement of young Colombians, and particularly young Colombians from poor neighborhoods, most notably in Cali. And what's been clear is that there's very high involvement from this sector of society, from young Colombians who are staying on the streets, who are organizing together collectively organizing like community kitchens, different points of resistance with people that have different roles in making sure that they keep the movement on the streets. And what you've also seen is like so many beautiful statements from other people celebrating the young people who are on the streets. Very early on, the government came out just trying to talk about terrorism, terrorist acts, vandals. And that might have worked in the past, but it didn't work this time. And now people are defending those kids, saying they're not vandals. These are kids that are standing up because they want a better future. These are kids standing up because they don't want to carry on living in poverty, living in a country without peace. So you have your more organized, established social movements and trade unions at one side, and they're now in talks with the government. But you also have this expression of youth frustration at Colombian economic reality. But its participation is much broader than that as well. You have middle classes involved, people in the cities who aren't necessarily from the poor neighborhoods. It's been really and the peasant communities coming, mobilizing from the countryside, the indigenous communities as well, mobilizing, joining the protesters in Cali. So it's really been a full spread of Colombian society, but particularly of note has been that involvement from the young people in the poor neighborhoods.
The protests have been successful so far. They've managed to show the deep discontent of the Colombian people with government policies. They have also revealed the brutality of the Colombian government's armed forces. And they've also managed to unite sectors of society. But why do the protests continue? What are their causes? And who is responsible for the victims? To understand the situation and explore the answers to these questions, it's necessary to stop and quickly look at the historical context of violence in Colombia. Let's start with this data. According to figures from the Institute of Historical Memory of Colombia, in the last 35 years, 20% of the population has been a direct victim of violence. Colombia has about 60 million inhabitants. That is 10 million victims. To put in context, London has 9 million inhabitants.
Mainly because Colombia, until 1960, more or less, was a very rural country. And one of the main difficulties we have found as society is that we have a huge inequality in how the land is distributed. Our country is of the size of Spain and France put together. However, a very small minority of Colombian elite owns most of the land. Yeah, my name is Myriam Ojeda. I am a Colombian citizen and a British citizen. I'm a dancer, dance teacher, and I'm an activist for peace in Colombia. That tradition that comes from obviously the neo or post-colonial times, and we're big owners of land. They only have people who work in the lands, but these people did not have right to own land. And I think that was the main problem that we carried through the 20th century until the middle of the 20th century. And that situation obviously created big displacements into the cities. By the 60s, the cities was populated by lots of people who are being displaced from their own territory.
Colombia has one of the longest civil wars in human history, right? Like it's been 57 years. And we know that this violence keeps on happening in rural areas that are Black and brown. And when I say brown, I mean like indigenous, it could be like mixed, but racialized people, right? I'm Ornella Ospino. I am from Cartagena, Colombia. And I'm a self-taught artist. Online, I go by the name Black Moody Boy. And I am a proud Afro-Indigenous trans queer person. Of course it's happening because these are communities that have been forgotten, right? By the state, by the government for so many years. I think it's really important to call it what it is like systemic racism and it's white supremacy working. As Latin Americans and like Colombians, we like to talk about that we're all mixed and we're all these things, but racism is very much alive. Like we don't live in a post-racist society. And we see it by the number of victims and the race of the victims and the class of the victims, right? And also like we know that Colombia has one of the biggest like inner displacement issues in the whole world, right? A lot of the people that live in Cali, in these communities, like for example, Siloé, were people who were displaced from other parts of the Pacific region. So this is like more trauma on top of more trauma. And then when they are like, we've had enough, then they're being told that they're violent.
There's extreme wealth in Colombia. It's an extremely wealthy country in terms of natural resources, in terms of access to the Caribbean Sea, the Pacific Sea, to rivers. The soil is so fertile, there's natural resources. So that means that, you know, there's some very wealthy people in Colombia and a lot of international companies that have taken a lot of wealth from Colombia. But there's also extreme poverty. So what there is extreme social inequality. There's lots of people with absolutely nothing. Just recently, the figures from the official Colombian Statistic Institute, the DANE, showed that over 40% of Colombians are now living in poverty. So that social inequality is a root cause of the violence. But it's not that people haven't tried to do things about it to change it. But whenever organizations, trade unions, peasant communities, indigenous communities, Afro-Colombians have tried to do something about that and change the political system or change the socioeconomic reality, they've been targeted with violence. And we've seen, you know, thousands of trade unionists killed, over 3,000 trade unionists killed since the 1970s. We know that the Patriotic Union political party was wiped out between the mid-1980s and mid-1990s. And we know how many social activists have been killed since the peace agreement was signed. So there's a political inequality, there's a political elite that have kept their power through violence. And so that means that the social inequality and political inequality have remained.
Within this context, it's essential to recognise the connection that exists between the 2016 peace process and the beginning of the social outbreak that began in 2019. The long-standing violence has made the country view peace as a seemingly impossible dream. People are tired of so much war and death. The country has made numerous attempts to put an end to the armed conflict, the last of which was in 2016, with the peace process signed between the government and the FARC guerrillas, an armed organisation that had around 20,000 members. The confrontation between the state and the guerrilla group lasted more than 50 years and has caused a high percentage of victims of violence in the country, especially when the victims of the paramilitary groups that functioned as armed self-defense groups are also tallied, in many cases with the backing of state agents to stop and dismantle the guerrillas. So the signing of the peace agreement meant for many people, especially those from rural areas, that there was hope to start a process of transformation from the root causes of violence in Colombia.
I left my country in the 90s when the situation was really difficult. And I think I never lost that connection, yes. But probably one of the events that brought me back with stronger ties was the possibility to open dialogues for peace and to sign some accords with the then guerrilla FARC-EP. I think that gave us some hope that the situation was going to change. And it took about a good 4 years before this peace agreement in 2016 was signed. And during that period, I reconnected very strongly back with my country. I think it was an opportunity for hope. It was an opportunity for having a different country. We, my generation, the generation of my mother and father, and the generation of my grandparents had never seen a country of peace. And I think many of us felt this time to change this endless cycle of violence. And we deserve, after so many decades of war, we deserve to have the opportunity to talk about peace. And we saw an opportunity. and we took it.
The reason we continue to see the peace agreement as such an important document to defend is because, one, it's really important from a humanitarian perspective to end armed conflict. When the peace deal was signed, when the ceasefires were agreed, there was a real difference in people's lives. And it was reported people were able to live without the fear of combats happening. And that obviously should be celebrated. But also what's so important about the peace process is it's extremely comprehensive. And there's 6 chapters of the agreement, and many of those chapters look at and start to try to address the social and political issues that I mentioned a moment ago that lie behind the armed conflict, lie behind the many decades of violence. So there's chapters which look at rural reform, how to ensure that peasants have access to land. There's chapters that look at the cocaine situation, how to ensure that coca farmers are able to transition to alternative crops rather than being criminalized. There's chapters around how to ensure political participation to broaden that political engagement. And these are all not the peace agreement is the answer to everything, but is a really important platform to start to address these social and political difficulties in Colombia.
The Democratic Center, the far-right party that assumed power post-2018 with President Iván Duque, was representing a portion of the Colombian society that did not agree with that peace agreement. This situation has generated a state of internal tension and a very deep political polarization that has ruined the agreement and its implementation, once again putting in jeopardy the hope of a country at peace.
There's an extremely powerful political force in Colombia, and sadly their discourse saying that the country is being handed over to terrorists, the transitional justice is impunity for the FARC, has had an impact and convinced many people. And one of the reasons I think it has been successful is because over decades of war in Colombia, the Colombian state was very successful in painting all of Colombia's problems as the fault of the FARC. So whether it's poverty, whether it's violence, whether it's drugs, everything was placed at the feet of the FARC. This strategy in information war was so successful that when, after decades of telling people that all the country's problems are the FARC, and then you're saying we're going to have peace talks with the FARC, for a lot of people that was understandably difficult. One of the biggest things that's faced attacks by the current government and the opponents of the peace process is the transitional justice system. And the reason they're so against the transitional justice system is because both the FARC, crimes committed by the FARC will be heard in there, but also crimes committed by the Colombian state. And that's not convenient for people that have been involved in those crimes or are related to those crimes or have benefited from those crimes. So that is why they are attacking the transitional justice system.
Let us return to the current 2021 protests that are ongoing right now in Colombia. As it is clear, the peace process has not been implemented, and the cycles of violence have intensified under the current government. However, it's evident that one of the results of this process being put aside is that now a large population have had their eyes opened. Since the FARC does not exist as an excuse for all the torments of the country, more Colombians have now managed to identify that the problems are more structural, and for the first time in many years, they feel empowered to protest and seek real change. Without the government being able to use the old tactic of stigmatizing the protest by calling the protesters guerrillas or communists, the people, especially the youth, seem to be willing to continue these demonstrations until they achieve profound change.
Basically, these kids were born in a model, and they haven't seen anything else from when they were kids to now they are young people or young adults. They just haven't tested any other option. And this model is being, as I said before, this model hasn't represented any opportunities for them. They do not see any way out because they were born in this model, they grew up in this model, and now they are becoming adults in this model. And they have seen that this model is not taking them anywhere but to poverty, a continuous increase in poverty. And the continued closing of opportunities, and they see no future ahead. So they have nothing to lose because they got nothing, absolutely nothing. What they have is hope, a vision, and that gut feeling that if this continues, they're going to be as miserable as we were, as our parents were, and our grandparents and our grandparents. I think they have said, okay, it's our time now, and we need to stop, and we need to search for other possibilities. And this one is not one that we want to consider anymore.
I think it happened because when you mess with people's food and you mess with people's bread, people are gonna be angry. Like, that's not something that you can just justify, right? Because they were gonna tax meat, they were gonna tax more, like the water bills, more electricity. And when you just mess with someone's basic living, people are gonna be angry. So I think what they want is to completely change everything. What the youths want is not reform, because by law, the things that are in place should work, but they don't. So I really think they want first to ensure that they are alive, because they're still getting killed, right? Because all the government are keep on inviting them to tables and talk, but they can't even guarantee that they're not going to keep on killing them. So that, for one, but also to allow them to protest because it's their fundamental right, but also to say the truth. I think a lot of them are very tired of being gaslit their whole lives, of being told that what it is what it is. But what it is that the government steals all this money, that they spend more money in police and army than to combat a pandemic.
The government's reaction to these unwavering demonstrations by civil society has been repression and the excessive use of force. On different alternative media and social network platforms, videos and photographs of police abuse during the protests have been circulating. The numbers of victims vary substantially, between the high numbers reported by human rights organizations in the country to reports, in many cases, non-existent or not updated by the Colombian authorities. The government and the traditional Colombian media have focused their narratives on denouncing vandalism and violent actions by some citizens, and thus presenting the measures of force as a solution to bring normality to the cities. However, many wonder, does broken glass, burned buses, and vandalized buildings justify the murder of dozens of people?
The human rights situation is horrendous in Colombia, and that's what we talk about a lot. What we've seen over the last 5 weeks, I think, has been particularly bad in terms of how extreme it's been and how constant it's been over 5 weeks. So we've seen killings. We have at least 43 killings by the police of protesters. Police shooting at protesters, unarmed protesters. We've seen multiple videos proving that. Established human rights organizations are denouncing this. Like I've mentioned the sexual assaults, I've mentioned the eye injuries, I've mentioned the arbitrary arrests. If you watch videos of what's happening, you see the brutal nature of what the police are doing. You see them surround protesters who are on their own, and you see 10, 15 police pile in and punch them and kick them. It's absolutely horrendous.
When something is so spontaneous and it comes from neighborhoods where it's not politically instigated, but it's more a bare necessity because people don't have food, then you can find obviously that there are some of them probably who are involved in some criminal activity that have used the context of the national strike to break some windows, to pull down some traffic lights, maybe steal, yes? But there is no death penalty in Colombia for that. And there is no death penalty at all. If these kids were, which is a minority, if they were committing this kind of vandalism, how it's been called, then they need to go to a normal process, judiciary process, and not being killed. But saying that, this is a minority. The big majority has had the support of the community.
I think it's been terror and fascism. I think it's been repression. I think it's been like the response has been in complete violation of human rights.
I think what's been coming to light even more over the last few days are two things that we need to pay particular attention to. One is the number of missing people. Now, it's really concerning how many people are being arrested and then their whereabouts are not known. Fortunately, a lot of the people who are reported missing then later appear. But when they do appear, what I've heard speaking to different human rights organizations is that they've been taken away without anyone knowing where they are. And when they come back, they've been beaten up. This is torture. This is forced disappearance. During that period that they're away and not their whereabouts aren't known about, that's forced disappearance. If they reappear later, fantastic. Obviously, we all want to see that. But this can't be happening. We don't know how many people are missing right now. According to the Attorney General's office, they've done some work now to document the figures, and they say there's 111 people currently missing. Human rights organizations say more. The second side into the government response is that they are not denouncing these police abuses. What they've been doing instead is stigmatizing the protesters. But in Colombia, we know that when government officials make statements saying that protesters are linked to criminal organizations, this is extremely dangerous. This can cause them to be killed. In a context when they are being killed, it's giving completely the wrong message and potentially giving a green light for further attacks against the protesters.
If the protesters are determined to risk their lives to generate a transcendental change, and they take that risk in front of their government, while its armed force violates them, what hope can these protesters have of continuing to exercise their right to a demonstration? In this case, it could be thought that the control entities, as a counterweight to the state, should be the main allies of the civilian population. However, for many in Colombia, government control entities are constrained by the government itself. For example, many officials of these institutions are known to be personal friends of the president. In this way, the executive branch in Colombia has no counterweight, and no one asks for accountability for the victims. Some consider that the Colombian government is moving towards authoritarianism, and having very little political control is part of this.
The other thing that is extremely worrying is the multiple incidents of people dressed in civilian clothing firing at protesters alongside police. The police doing absolutely nothing. And whether these are police dressed as civilians or whether they are civilians who are attacking the protesters because they don't like what they're doing, it's completely unacceptable. And particularly given the history of paramilitarism in Colombia, we know about the close relationship between the Colombian state and paramilitaries. This is particularly scary in terms of in broad daylight, having people in civilian clothes shooting at protesters, and the police not doing anything about it. The government then doing nothing about it.
Me gusta salir a marchar, sacar la rabia y celebrar. Me gusta salir a marchar y con mi cuerpo ir a luchar y no olvidar ni perdonar hasta la libertad recuperar y no olvidar ni perdonar un pueblo masacrado por caminar. Me gusta salir.
The Colombian population does not have internal institutional support, which is why it's necessary to draw the attention of the international community. For many people in Colombia, and an important part of the Colombian diaspora outside the national territory, supporting the visibility of what is happening in Colombia is transcendental as a way of generating accountability in the face of serious cases of excesses on the part of the Colombian state. The reactions of the international community have been mixed, from the voices committed to demanding respect for human rights in Colombia and others that have not reacted effectively or forcefully.
I think for the first time, the Colombian government are very lonely in their narrative. Obviously, there are far rights and organizations around the world who will support them and governments who will support them, but the vast majority of the international community have called for dialogue and for the end of violence. All the 17 embassies of the European Union in Colombia published a statement demanding the end of violence and the need to enter a dialogue. That was never happened before. Never happened before. 50-something members of Congress in the United States started to demand the end of financial support to the forces, the police, especially the police and the SMAT. This never happened before. Here in the UK, we've been pushing for a early day motion in the parliament, who has been signed for now over 70 MPs, thanks to the work of many citizens, both British and Colombians, who are asking their MP about their support to these police forces in Colombia, with not only with money, but with training. And we're asking them to be accountable for this support. And we're asking them whether they are aware that the funding that is from the taxpayers' money is going to these forces who are clearly breaching all the international human rights laws. So these are questions that we internationally are making.
The response internationally has been crystal clear. The abuses of the Colombian government aren't hidden as much as they used to be. People are seeing the true face of the Colombian police and the Colombian government, and they're saying that this isn't acceptable.
As much as Britain, Europe like to portray themselves as being interested in human rights and the violations that go on everywhere in the world, it's clear to see that they have preferences as to who they focus on. I'm Carlos Cruz Mosqueda. I consider myself an activist. I'm also doing a PhD at Queen Mary University. But most importantly, in the current situation with Colombia, I guess what defines me the most is my work with Red Condor Collective, which is an organization that I co-founded with a few other Colombian, immigrants. We consider ourselves part of the Colombian diaspora. In China, very recently, there's the question of the Uyghur Muslim population, which, it's a complex case. It's difficult to verify what's going on in the region. And even though it's difficult to verify, the British and the US government have been very quick to sanction, to push human rights organizations to pressure China to let them in and observe and so on. However, the response in Colombia, where there is clearly, the evidence is clear, the reaction has been so slow, so diplomatic, compared to, say, their reaction to the situation in China. Just, it kind of shows that there is an economic and political, geopolitical interest.
Regarding the specific relationship of Colombia with the United Kingdom, the relationship of allies is recognized. Britain provides funding, has trade agreements, and supports the Colombian armed forces with training and logistics, including ESMAD, the anti-riot force unit of the Colombian police, which is in the eye of the storm when speaking of the abuse and crimes against protesters.
So the British government and the Colombian government are close allies. Colombia has been a military ally for many years, an economic ally. There's been new partnerships being built around environmental issues. But historically, throughout the period of Uribe, Santos, Duque, Colombia has always been a friend to Britain. You'll rarely, if ever, hear any public criticism of the Colombian government, even during the darkest periods under Álvaro Uribe, when hundreds of trade unions were being killed every year, when paramilitaries were operating side by side with the Colombian military. You would rarely hear any criticism of Colombia, and the military support would continue. There was a suspension of military aid during the Labour government, which Justice for Colombia campaigned for. But there's still arms export licenses, which is what has to be given for arms sales to take place to a country. There's still, I haven't got the number in my head now, but there's still millions of pounds worth of arms being sold to Colombia by British arms companies every year. This is just absolutely outrageous for a country with such recognized human rights abuses, a military which is known to commit such severe human rights abuses. There's also a police training cooperation been happening for several years. Now, a number of MPs have been trying to elicit more information about this training. We know that there's a new project that's just been initiated that's about a £2 million project of police training aimed at least from what we're told, is aimed at improving sort of community policing. On surface, this is something that's clearly needed if we look at the way that these recent protests have been policed. But there have been many people asking what is Britain doing to ensure that it's not supporting police forces that are involved in human rights abuses? And the answers so far have not been forthcoming, which is very worrying. Of course, it's very worrying. British taxpayers' money could potentially be going right now to supporting police killing, beating, assaulting protesters on the streets of Colombia. And that is something that is completely unacceptable.
There's trades that have happened that have benefited British business at the expense of Colombian population who are displaced from their lands or who are sometimes often massacred as well in order to, try and get access to resources or the cheap labor that Colombian people provide so that British people can have certain commodities that they wouldn't have otherwise. Our country has played a role in what's going on in Colombia, economically, politically, and in terms of military and police aid. So I think the UK, those of us who live here, those who are from this country, have a duty or responsibility to hold their government accountable.
In the context of this very grave situation of violence against protesters by the Colombian government, which has no counterweights within the same country, it is known that many countries in the world that have political and economic alliances with Colombia have withheld from taking concrete actions to press for a change in the violent management that the state has shown. It is essential not only to generate pressure on the Colombian government, but also on the allied countries and their government policies of intentional support. Within this alternative, the union of civil society on a global scale is envisaged as a way to generate specific actions that can exert pressure on allied governments and, as a consequence, on Colombia. In the particular case of the United Kingdom, we want to share with you some of the actions that our guests are currently taking, including some invitations to join strategies to report and try to stop the violence in Colombia. We are inviting all those who listen to us, who are not in the United Kingdom, to reach out to their Colombian community in their country and join the international pressure from civil society.
Now, Justice for Colombia is also supporting a platform that's just been created, which has been really vibrant and really amazing, called S.O.S Colombia UK. And that's predominantly Colombian community in London, but also other people. I'm obviously not Colombian, and others who are friends of the Colombian community and the Colombian cause. And S.O.S Colombia UK have been doing amazing things, making great videos, joining protests that had been organised, holding a really amazing vigil a couple of weeks ago, bringing together Colombian communities, amazing like music and dance and just talking about the situation, but also trying to lobby. And Justice for Colombia has also been supporting this with other organisations here. And this has been, great to show MPs that people care about Colombia, so they need to take attention. So obviously I would encourage everyone to check out Justice for Colombia, check out S.O.S Colombia UK, and write a letter to their MP.
Well, they can do many things. One of the things they can do is to join us in our campaign to the EDM for Colombia. It's the hashtag is EDM for Colombia, to ask your MP to sign the letter. Our campaign S.O.S. Colombia UK. We are in all social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We are providing all the links for making instant letters to your MP and your area. It's a very easy process. It takes less than a minute, and it could save one life.
I mean, there's lots of ways. You know, we don't, as my organization, we don't believe ourselves to be like the only way to do things. But what we do is we've collected funds. We've up until now £53,000, and those £53,000 we've been sending to grassroots human rights organizations, like say in Medellin, there's an organization called Chucho Minga, which is a grassroots organization made up of human rights workers and lawyers who go around the different police stations looking for the disappeared or looking for the detained to make sure that they're treated correctly. And because, you know, in Colombia, if you're disappeared, unfortunately, you know, it's likely they've killed you. And so these groups are very active in trying to make sure that these people are accounted for, you know, and that they don't disappear and don't come back to their homes. We've also started to work with a coalition of different lawyers in Cali. Cali is like one of the most affected cities in Colombia with these protests. And so these collective of lawyers that we're also funding with the money we've collected, again, are representing the protesters. So they're paying their bail money. In Colombia, of course, like the working class protesters aren't going to have the bail money to free themselves, or to pay a lawyer for there to be like a fair trial and they can defend themselves as they should. You know, we're sending this money so that these people can represent themselves and empower them, so that there is some kind of justice for the people that are detained wrongfully, unlawfully, and put on trial for things like terrorism, as well as other things that we do as well, which is support ollas comunitarias, so, you know, the mutual aid, food mutual aid groups in the neighborhoods who are feeding the protesters. We support medical brigades who are on the front line, attending to protesters who have been shot and injured. We've been saying like that's our way of being on the front line directly, you know, tangibly, materially, maybe not physically, but materially, you know, where we are having an impact, a tangible impact. We don't need food or bombs. I think we need solidarity.
For many Colombians, both those who are in Colombia and those of us abroad, the hope of a better country, a country in peace that can enjoy its wealth and where violence and death are not the daily occurrences, becomes the main reason to continue moving ahead, to continue resisting. And although this call to resistance appears for the first time in the reality of many Colombians, especially those in the cities who for the first time have seen the horror that a large population of the country lives daily in rural areas, for others, it continues to be yet another day of resistance.
I saw this post the other day that really touched me, that because they're making like squads, like queer squads, like trans femme squads, and they had like a banner that said, "To be queer is not for the weak, it's for the brave in this country." And I really thought about that. I guess that is to say that we, I say myself we because I am this identities and I have been in Colombia with my identities. We have always been resisting. We have always been resisting. And we know that when this is done, we will still resist, right? So I guess to say it's like from the perspective of queer organizers, of sex workers, of racialized people, is that they're not afraid of this violence because they know it. But it doesn't make it normal. And we need to also like acuerpar, like really show up constantly, because this happens all the time. So I think it's really important to realize and remember that at the front line of these struggles have always been queer people, have always been Black people, have always been Indigenous people. because the state has made us their enemy. So I guess it's also like for those communities, there's no option, right? Like resistance is a way of life, because if you're being persecuted your entire life, all you know is resistance. But it's important to recognize that and to not let them suffer alone, because it's easier to take down an enemy or the oppressor together, and realizing that they're all interconnected struggles, right?
New for some, but historical for others, the idea, the need, and the responsibility to resist is today the overriding motive of more and more Colombians who do not want any more war and are crying out for the opportunity to create a new future. 2021 will be remembered in the history of Colombia, and it will be told in many ways. Some, as usual, will be censored, others stigmatized, and others celebrated. But if there is something that will be impossible to erase, it is the deep feeling of pain, frustration, anger, and hope that Colombians live today. And if for some reason it is not printed in the history books, it'll be impossible to erase it from the songs, videos, paintings, photographs, murals, poems, and countless other artistic expressions that have emanated from the creative energy that rising and not knowing if today will be your last day on earth clearly creates.
A Black revolutionary artist once said that the responsibility of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. And I really have been thinking about that. And I think art has a huge role. I've been also so inspired by artists in Colombia. Like, the art has been incredible. And like how they protect each other too. Like, they will stop the traffic and paint in the road, or like draw like a giant fist in a monument. And you know, from that money generate ways of community care, right? Like creating ollas comunitarias, like soup kitchens to feed people. I've seen a lot of trans activists that they dress like cops and like mock them. And then they have like all these songs. So it's been very beautiful like to see, and it's really like revitalized me, I think, to remind me where I come from. And that my rage is justified, and all of our rage is justified. I'm just very worried about the lives and the trauma as well. And also, also what I've learned from my sister Adriana Guzman, who resisted in Bolivia, the coup. Also remembering that machismo kills a lot of these boys, right? Because they think that they're bulletproof, but they are babies at the end of the day. So I'm very worried for their families, for the disappeared people. I'm very concerned about that, and yeah. But I'm hopeful still that they are doing something that many of us never dared to do. So I'm very proud as well.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Puente Bridge Podcast. We hope that this audiovisual document helps listeners to understand the situation in which Colombia is living. We are aware of the complexity and the many sides that exist in this reality, and we know that we have not covered them all. So it is essential to be critical, to ask, to consult, and communicate. If knowing better about the situation in Colombia inspires you to actively participate and be part of those who want to generate changes, in the description of this episode, you will find a link that leads you to various actions enabling you to help Colombia. In particular, the Early Day Motion for Colombia, mentioned by Myriam, and the financial support pages of Red Condor Collective and other organizations. Before leaving this episode of Puente Bridge Podcast, we wanted to open a creative possibility to visualize what an ideal Colombia would be. We built with our guests an imaginary painting of what Colombia could look like if the process that is currently being lived set the foundations to transform the social, political, and economic conditions of the country. These are their answers.
I'll emphasize again the importance of implementing the peace agreement. If the peace agreement that was signed in 2016 is fully implemented, all the different chapters are fully implemented with a government that fully supports it, that encourages the Colombian population to fully support it, that brings alongside the peace process, all those that have previously been opposed to it. If there's a government that tries to do that and the peace agreement is implemented, Colombia will be a very, very different place. Still with lots of work to be done, no doubts, like anywhere, but it will be transformed. And that's why I think it's so important that we keep calling for the full implementation of the peace agreement.
Have a society where our different proposals, our different ideologies, our different views of what society should be are respected. So I think, we need to, first create the conditions so that politically there is the freedom to express ourselves politically, ideologically, in whatever way we want to. And as a socialist, I hope that one day those conditions can maybe, if the people want it, can maybe lead to a government where the working class, the oppressed, Black, Indigenous people, communities have political power and economic power.
Oh, I think it would be green. It would be very green. It would be safe. I think women will be able to walk the street and not be scared. I think queer people will be able to be their full selves in the street without fear of being attacked or losing their lives. Like a Colombia where people can live off their jobs without having to compromise their dreams. And I imagine one where we have land, where people have land, and that they don't have to have 5 or 6 jobs or have to leave. I think a Colombia where Colombians are, because so many of us aren't there.
Yo creo que es una oportunidad de colores. I think it's an opportunity in colors, in difference, that we can think different, see the life in different colors, but we do not have to erase each other from the picture. We can all be in the picture. It's as simple as that. Bueno, me hicieron llorar. No, esto es muy duro, muchachos. Esto es muy duro.
And you? How would you paint a new Colombia?